Hello, and welcome to another presentation from the Academic Writing Program at the University of Maryland. I'm Linda McCree, Director of Academic Writing, and today we'll be considering figures of speech. Do you remember what Neil Armstrong said when he landed on the moon, even if you weren't alive at the time? I'm sure you can quote what is, no doubt, the most famous line from John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. And you could probably recall something President Franklin Delano Roosevelt said in his first inaugural address, too. And I know you know what Julius Caesar reported to the Roman Senate regarding a recent victory in what is now Turkey. What do these four moments in history and the discourse about them have in common? Why do you know these famous lines, even if you aren't really sure of their context? You know them, of course, in part because they were repeated again and again, but they were repeated again and again because they were powerfully phrased, because the authors used figures of speech to shape their messages. Not really sure you remember them? Oh, I'm pretty sure you do. Let's take a look at them with a little more detail.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Yes, of course you knew what Neil Armstrong said. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. One thing I like about this phrase is that having heard it many times, it always seems quite natural to me. I think it wasn't until years after I'd heard it for the first time that it occurred to me that NASA must have carefully determined what that first sentence would be, that it was probably a major speech writing effort for someone to write a phrase that would be Armstrong's first words as he stepped onto the moon and as the whole world was watching. It never occurred to me that it didn't just roll off of Armstrong's tongue, because, in fact, it doesn't sound particularly wooden or artificial. So let's take a look at what's happening in the phrase. You easily recognize there's a pattern here. What's the pattern? Well, Armstrong repeats the structure of the first phrase in the second phrase, while simultaneously offering a contrast between these two parts that speaks volumes about the event, right? From a small step to a giant leap. Small is contrasted with giant, step contrasted with leap, and man contrasted with mankind as well. The sentence really emphasizes in a compact, rather rhythmic way how tremendous this event is, right? There's a nice sound to the sentence. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The pause in the middle creates a kind of rhythm, and the repetition and the parallelism of the structure creates a rhythm as well. If we were to try and make the same point without that pattern, we might say something such as, it may have been easy for me to just step onto the moon, but years of work by others went into this effort, and with this step, mankind has moved forward in a tremendous way. All right, well, someone would have written something a little better than that. But one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind says all that I was just trying to say, and a lot more, really, in a very compact and lyrical manner. So there's a name for this figure of speech. It's called an antithesis. And what is an antithesis? An antithesis is a figure of balance. We saw that the two parts of the sentence were balanced. The parts of an antithesis exist in parallel. They also have an opposing or antithetical idea, and those ideas are offered with emphasis for contrast. So small and giant, step and leap, even man and mankind. The contrast there, even when not complete, even man and mankind aren't completely antithetical, but the contrast there creates a kind of emphasis. Here's a fuller definition from a great site, AmericanRhetoric.com. Antithesis is a figure of balance in which two contrasting ideas are intentionally juxtaposed, usually through parallel structure. It's a contrasting of opposing ideas in adjacent phrases, clauses, or sentences. So an antithesis is one example of a figure of speech, but what exactly is a figure of speech? We hear that phrase, that's just a figure of speech, that's meant to mean something. I think closer really we use that phrase to mean something, it's just idiomatic, it's just a way of saying thing. But a figure of speech is in fact a rhetorical element of style. And it's an element of style that's both common and uncommon in its use. In fact, we use figures of speech all the time without even thinking about it. We use metaphors to describe things. We sometimes omit commas or pauses in our sentences. We offer things up in parallel. We reverse word order to create a sense of emphasis in our sentences. So even though many of the famous figures of speech that we know are from uncommon moments, things like landing on the moon or the inaugural address of a president, we really use figures of speech quite commonly. Figures of speech shape both our diction and our thought, right? So they shape the way we speak, but they also shape the way we think. We think in metaphors often. We think in kinds of comparisons. So that's not just about how we talk, but also how we think. And finally, figures of speech are generally divided into at least two categories: schemes, which are variations in the arrangements of words, and tropes, which are variations in the way we expect a word or idea to be expressed. So the antithesis was more of a scheme, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. There's some kind of variation in arrangement there, but rather than a trope, whereas a metaphor is a trope. Now, you've been hearing about figures of speech for years in school. No doubt these phrases are common from your study of literature, particularly your study of poetry. But all of these figures of speech, and many, many more, exist in everyday prose as well. In everyday prose, in high prose like speeches, in written prose and academic prose, and we'll take a look at some of that in a minute. But let's go back to our examples of famous moments and why figures of speech have an impact on us. Do you remember what FDR said in his first inaugural address? A famous line about fear?
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
That's right. It's in FDR's first inaugural address that he used the phrase, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." In fact, that was in the first paragraph of his inaugural address. Well, what's the pattern, or what's the figure of speech going on here? We recognize that this is a figure of repetition. FDR is quite simply repeating the word. But we notice that there's no sense of redundancy here. We don't think he's just using the same words over and over again. His repetition of the word fear really imbues the sentence with a kind of meaning. Again, let's think about how else FDR might have said this phrase, what it means, how we might paraphrase it. We might say, we don't really need to be afraid of anything. Well, that doesn't really sound very memorable. Here's this. This one's a little more formal. Americans should not fear because we are a resilient nation. That sounds something a politician would say, but still not particularly memorable. We only have to be afraid of fear. Oh, well, that one's already kind of figured itself, because afraid and fear, even though that's not an exact repetition of the word, they're very similar words, and that's its own kind of figure of repetition. So we see that that simple act of repetition in that part of the sentence really heightens the meaning, really becomes, I've used the phrase compact, right? It becomes very compact what he's trying to say. All these other paraphrases that I've tried to come up with really are, for the most part, longer or are figured themselves. So it turns out if we look at the whole sentence is figured in many ways. So we've already talked about this part, but the next part of the sentence, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified, we see a pattern there too. Do you recognize what it is? So one of the things we recognize in nameless, unreasoning, unjustified is that the conjunctions are omitted. And that creates this kind of rhythm. It has a certain sound to it that's very different than it would, it sounds very different than if there were ands there. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified. Connected to that sense of rhythm, we recognize that there's something else in that trio of terms, and that's a sense of climax, from nameless to unreasoning to unjustified. So we could say overall that there's that becomes a figure of emphasis, the omission of conjunctions and the sense of climax. Those are all their own, they actually all have their own names for figures, but in general we want to recognize that there's emphasis created there, a sense of rhythm and a sense of emphasis. The very end of that sentence offers a figure as well, or uses a figure. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. And hopefully you recognize that one right away as well. Retreat into an advance, those are opposites. And what happens at the end of that sentence with the emphasis created by those opposites is that really what's being emphasized is that earlier idea about fear and the potential damage of fear. So while we famously know the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, FDR in the rest of that sentence really emphasized that idea about fear. And the end of the emphasis is a figure of contrast. He wants us not to be afraid. We need to not retreat into fear, but advance away from fear. All right, did you remember yet what Julius Caesar said about his victory in what's now Rome? I came, I saw, I conquered. Now, I'm sure you already realize that there's repetition there and a sense of climax. I came, I saw, I conquered. It's repeating the lengths of the sentences, the kinds of sentences, and then, of course, again, there's a climax. But, of course, Julius Caesar didn't say this in English. He said it in Latin, and in Latin, the phrase is even more figured. And I bet you know this Latin phrase, even if you never studied Latin at all. Veni, vidi, vici. And what makes that so powerful, and again, part of why it's been so powerfully remembered, is again the way that it's figured. And you can recognize all sorts of figures there. Again, of course, it's still a figure of climax. I came, I saw, I conquered. We know that from the translation. But without even knowing what these words mean, we also see that there's there's balance, and this has incredible balance. You probably couldn't make 3 sentences have any more balance, right? They are exactly the same length, exactly the same number of syllables, and that all creates a sense of rhythm, veni, vidi, vici. And this, of course, is helped by the fact that in Latin, words tended to end with vowels, but the repetition of opening sounds and closing sounds, those are particular figures as well. You know, alliteration is the repetition of beginning sounds, and there's a word for the repetition of ending sounds as well. That's its own kind of figure. So this is part of why that is such a powerfully remembered phrase, both in English and even if you never studied in Latin, you probably do know it in Latin. Well, in contrast to Julius Caesar, one of the best known orators of the 20th century, JFK, also used a lot of figures of speech in his speeches. And let's listen for probably the most famous line out of his inaugural address.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
So here's that line from JFK's inaugural address, probably the line we most associate with JFK, certainly with that speech. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. I'm sure you see the pattern in here. Let's take a closer look at it. Moves basically the idea of your country and you. They switch places. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And there's a name for this. This is an antimetabole. And what does that mean? What is an antimetabole? Well, it's a repetition of words in successive phrases or clauses in reverse grammatical order. Or it may be an inversion of a phrase or a clause that creates a kind of mirror image. So the you and your country switch places, right? They reverse paces. And according to American rhetoric, it's a figure of balance in which 2 contrasting ideas are intentionally juxtaposed, usually through parallel structure. It could be a contrasting of opposing ideas in adjacent phrases, clauses, or sentences. Like FDR's speech, if we take a look at the entirety of JFK's inaugural speech, we see that the whole speech is highly figured. So why does JFK use so many figures of speech? Well, the figures create a very pleasing sound for the speech, thus making it much more enjoyable to listen to. It sounds more poetic, it has a rhythm to it. But also the figures help to make the speech more compact. We certainly saw that in the Neil Armstrong quote, that we can say much more in a very small tightly constructed figure than we can in a much longer explanation.